When I think back to the first time I met Claire, I realize that the moment is carved into me like a scar that never quite fades. It was late autumn, the kind of evening when the air feels sharp enough to cut, and I had ducked into a dimly lit cafe more out of habit than hunger. The place was quiet, save for the hum of an old espresso machine and the scratch of pens on paper from a few students scattered around. And then there she was, sitting by the window, her hair catching the glow of the street lamp outside, a faint smile on her lips as if she were holding back a secret. I remember telling myself not to stare, not to be obvious, but she had the kind of presence that made ignoring her impossible. Every gesture seemed deliberate, graceful but not rehearsed. When she glanced up and caught me looking, she didn't look away like most would. Instead, she held my gaze for just long enough to make me feel both seen and exposed. It wasn't long before I found myself walking over, words stumbling out of my mouth as though my tongue had betrayed me. She laughed softly at whatever clumsy thing I said and gestured to the empty chair across from her. That laugh, light, knowing, almost teasing, was the first thread in the web she would eventually spin around me. We talked until the cafe closed, our conversation flowing as if we had been rehearsing it for years. She asked me questions no one had ever bothered to ask, and when I answered, she listened as if my words carried weight. I left that night with her number scribbled on a napkin, my chest buzzing with a strange mixture of excitement and fear. Over the weeks that followed, we became inseparable. Dinners turned into late-night walks, and late-night walks turned into mornings where I woke up with her hair spilling across my pillow. Claire had this uncanny ability to make the ordinary feel extraordinary. A trip to the grocery store with her became an adventure. A rainy day indoors felt like a carefully staged play, with her laughter filling the silences. But even in those early days, when everything seemed intoxicating, there were moments, tiny fractures in the glass, that I chose to ignore. A phone call she'd step outside to take, a text she'd quickly swipe away, a sudden shift in her expression when certain topics arose. Each time she would disarm me with a smile or a kiss, and I'd convince myself I was imagining things. Love makes you blind, but with Claire, it made me willfully so. One night, months into our whirlwind, we attended a party at one of her friends' apartments. The place was crowded, filled with music and people who seemed to orbit around Claire as if she were the sun. I watched her work the room, her hand occasionally finding mine, her lips brushing my ear when she wanted to share a private joke. But there was a moment, a fleeting one, when I saw her lean in close to a man I didn't recognize. Their conversation was brief, but the way she tilted her head, the way he smiled as if they shared some private history, left me with a knot in my stomach. When I asked her about it later, she laughed it off. "An old friend," she said, pressing her lips to mine. "You worry too much." And just like that, my doubts dissolved under the warmth of her touch. Still, the thought lingered. And once a seed of doubt is planted, it grows in silence, waiting for the right moment to break through the surface. Our love deepened, but so did the inconsistencies. There were weekends when she claimed she needed space, when she'd vanish with vague explanations about work or obligations. I tried not to press too hard, afraid that pushing would drive her away. Instead, I buried my unease beneath layers of trust, or what I wanted to believe was trust. Looking back now, I see how I set the stage for everything that came after. I gave her the power to shape my world, to bend my reality with her words and gestures. And she wielded that power with a skill I still can't decide was instinct or calculation. The first real fracture came one cold January evening. I had stopped by her apartment unannounced, carrying a bottle of wine and the foolish hope of surprising her. The moment I knocked, something felt off. It took her longer than usual to answer, and when she finally did, her hair was tousled, her expression startled. "Everything okay?" I asked, holding up the wine like an offering. She hesitated before smiling. "Of course, just wasn't expecting you." Inside, the apartment carried a warmth, but also a tension I couldn't quite name. A jacket I didn't recognize lay draped over the back of a chair. I told myself it could be a friend's, a neighbor, anyone's. But the seed of doubt that had been quietly growing inside me pushed further toward the light. That night, though we laughed and drank and pretended everything was as it should be, I felt the distance between us widening. Her eyes didn't always meet mine, and her laughter seemed a little too rehearsed. And yet I stayed. I stayed because love has a way of turning lies into lullabies if you let it. Because the thought of losing her felt more unbearable than the quiet terror of being deceived. I didn't know it then, but that night was the beginning of the unraveling. The unraveling was slow, deliberate, almost merciless in how it teased me with half-truths and fleeting moments of clarity. Weeks passed, and with them came more signs, too many to keep dismissing. A half-heard conversation when I walked into the room, a sudden lock screen change on her phone, evenings when she swore she was at her sister, but answered my calls with a voice that carried the echo of somewhere else. Still, I told myself I was imagining things. I became an expert at rationalizing. Maybe she was just private, maybe she needed her own world outside of ours. Relationships aren't meant to be suffocating, I reminded myself. And yet, beneath every reassurance I whispered to my own conscience, the gnawing sense of betrayal only grew sharper. The breaking point came on a night when winter still gripped the city in its icy fists. I had been out with a couple of friends, trying to distract myself from the unease that had become my constant companion. But distraction is a fragile thing. One message, one word can shatter it. That night it was a photo. A friend of mine, half drunk and always too curious for his own good, showed me his phone with a smirk. "Isn't this Claire?" he asked. The photo was grainy, snapped hastily in the dim light of a bar, but there was no mistaking her. Claire, my Claire, sitting in a corner booth, her hand intertwined with someone else. The world narrowed to a tunnel. The voices around me blurred, the laughter turned hollow. I stared at the photo, my throat tightening, my chest collapsing inward. It wasn't just the image, it was the confirmation of what I had refused to admit. I didn't storm out. I didn't cause a scene. Instead, I excused myself with the kind of calm that only comes from being split open too deep to bleed right away. I walked home that night with the city pressing in on me, every streetlight too bright, every sound too sharp. When I finally confronted her, I expected denial. I expected her to fight, to twist the truth until it resembled something tolerable. But Claire didn't deny it. She didn't even flinch. "Yes," she said simply, her voice quiet, almost detached. "There's someone else." The words sliced through me, but what haunted me more was her composure. No tears, no pleading, no frantic apologies. Just the calm acknowledgement of a truth she had long accepted, even if I hadn't. "Why?" I asked, though the word felt meaningless as it left my lips. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Because you don't own me. Because love doesn't mean possession. Because sometimes one person isn't enough." It wasn't the answer I wanted. It wasn't even one I understood. But it was the only one she gave me. I left her apartment that night, the bottle of wine from weeks before still sitting half-finished on her counter, its cork jammed in crookedly. As I walked down her street, the air colder than I could bear, I told myself it was over, that I was done, that no one survives betrayal like this and still clings to the source of it. But I was wrong. Days turned into weeks, and though I tried to move forward, she lingered. In the quiet moments before sleep, in the familiar corners of the city we had claimed as ours, in the ghost of her laughter echoing in my memory. She reached out, too, sometimes a text, sometimes a call, sometimes nothing more than a song link sent in the middle of the night. Little reminders that she was still there, that I hadn't erased her, that perhaps she hadn't erased me either. And against my better judgment, I responded. Not always, not eagerly, but enough. Enough to keep the thread alive, frayed though it was. One evening, months after the confession, she showed up at my door. I opened it to find her standing there, soaked from the rain, eyes red as though she had been crying. For the first time in all our unraveling, she looked fragile. "Can I come in?" she asked. I should have said no. I should have closed the door and sealed myself off from the storm she carried with her. But I stepped aside. I let her in. We didn't speak much that night. She curled up on my couch, shivering beneath a blanket, and I sat beside her in silence. Eventually, she rested her head on my shoulder and I let her. The weight of her felt both foreign and familiar, a reminder of what I had lost and what I could never truly regain. In the dim glow of the lamp, she whispered, "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, fragile, uncertain. I wanted to believe them, to cling to them as proof that she regretted everything. But deep down, I knew they weren't enough. Sorry doesn't stitch a wound that deep. Sorry doesn't undo the image of her hand in someone else. And yet, I forgave her. Not in words, not in any formal declaration, but in the simple act of holding her as she drifted to sleep. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't always about the other person. Sometimes it's about the unbearable weight of carrying anger you can't set down. In that moment, I wasn't sure if I was a fool or if I was simply human. Maybe both. The storm between us hadn't passed. If anything, it had only grown more complicated. But as I watched her breathing steady in the quiet of my apartment, I knew one thing with painful certainty. My story with Claire wasn't over. Not yet. If the first act of our story was love and the second betrayal, then the third was a purgatory, a gray space where I could neither let her go nor fully take her back. Claire became both the wound and the balm, the fire and the water, and I, unwilling or unable to decide, drifted between them like a man trapped in a tide too strong to resist. After that night on my couch, she returned to me in fragments. Some days she was the Claire I had fallen for, laughing at my jokes, cooking in my kitchen, her voice soft and warm as she told me about her day. Other days she was distant, a stranger wearing a familiar face, her eyes somewhere else, her phone never far from her hand. I told myself I could live with the uncertainty, that loving her in pieces was better than not loving her at all. But every compromise I made carved a little more of me away. There was one evening, early spring, that still burns in my memory. We had gone for a walk along the river, the air cool but gentle, the city alive with the first signs of thaw. Claire seemed restless, her hands buried in her coat pockets, her gaze darting to the water as though it might reveal some secret. Finally she said, "You deserve better than me." It wasn't a confession, nor was it an apology. It was something in between, a statement that dangled in the air, daring me to challenge it. "Then why are you here?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. She looked at me, and for once I saw no mask in her expression. "Because you're the only one who sees me, really sees me, and I can't let that go." The honesty in her voice was devastating. I hated her for it, and I loved her for it. I wanted to push her into the river and pull her closer all at once. That was the paradox of Claire. She broke me and then convinced me I was stronger for surviving the breaking. Our nights became unpredictable. Sometimes she would arrive at my door with tears in her eyes, begging for closeness. Other times she would disappear for days, returning with excuses too thin to hold but too tempting for me to reject. I began to measure time not in days or weeks, but in the rhythm of her presence and absence. My friends noticed. They told me I was destroying myself, that she was manipulating me, that I had become a shadow of the man I once was. Maybe they were right, but what they couldn't see, what they refused to understand, was the way she made the world feel alive when she was near. Even in betrayal, even in the chaos, she carried a gravity I couldn't escape. One night, as we lay tangled in sheets that smelled of both intimacy and desperation, I asked her, "Do you love me?" She was quiet for so long that I thought she had fallen asleep, but then she whispered, "In the only way I know how." It wasn't the answer I wanted. It wasn't even clear what it meant, but I clung to it anyway, as if those words could anchor me in the storm. Yet storms don't stay still. They move, they change, they grow. The turning point came one afternoon when I stopped by her apartment unexpectedly. I had been working nearby and thought, naively, that surprising her might rekindle some fragment of the love we once shared. But when she opened the door, the scene that greeted me was unmistakable. A man's shoes by the entryway, the faint scent of cologne that wasn't mine, the sound of water running in the bathroom. For a moment time fractured. Claire's face drained of color, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I simply turned and walked away, her voice chasing me down the hallway, calling my name, begging me to stop. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something inside me had finally snapped, not with rage but with exhaustion. That night I sat alone in my apartment, the silence louder than any argument we had ever had. I stared at the walls, at the half-empty bottle of whiskey on the counter, at the phone buzzing with her desperate messages. And for the first time, I let the reality sink in. She wasn't mine to keep, and maybe she never had been. Yet even in that moment of clarity, I couldn't bring myself to block her number. I couldn't erase her from my life. Instead, I left the door cracked, just enough for her shadow to slip through whenever she chose. Some part of me still hoped she would change, that the weight of her choices would pull her back to me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Hope is just another form of self-deception. Claire didn't stop calling. She didn't stop appearing, sometimes at my door, sometimes in the places she knew I frequented. She was like smoke. You could wave your hand through it, try to scatter it, but it would always linger, always cling to the air around you. And me, I kept breathing her in, even as it poisoned me. I tell you this not because I'm proud of it, but because it's the truth. Love, when twisted by betrayal, doesn't end cleanly. It drags on, a wound that scabs and reopens, until you no longer know what healthy skin feels like. What I didn't know then was that the real twist hadn't come yet. What happened next would make everything before look like nothing more than the opening act. The twist arrived not with fury but with silence, a silence so heavy it felt like a verdict. After weeks of her unpredictable visits, the messages, the midnight calls that kept me tethered to her chaos, Claire simply vanished. No explanation, no warning, just absence. At first I told myself it was temporary. Maybe she needed space, maybe she was guilty, maybe she was finally realizing the damage she had caused. I checked my phone every hour, waiting for the familiar vibration, the flash of her name across the screen. Nothing came. Days bled into weeks, and the void she left behind grew unbearable. My apartment, once a sanctuary, became a tomb of echoes. The blanket she had used that rainy night still sat folded on the couch. A single strand of her hair clung stubbornly to my pillow, mocking me each morning. I tried to erase her, burned the notes she'd left, deleted our photos, scrubbed my place of her traces. But erasure is not healing. It's only pretending, and I was a terrible pretender. One evening, desperate for distraction, I agreed to meet an old college friend for drinks. We hadn't spoken in years, and the nostalgia of the reunion was a welcome balm. But as the night wore on, laughter dulled into weariness, and he leaned across the table with a look I couldn't quite read. "You should know something," he said, lowering his voice. "Claire's not gone, at least, not in the way you think." The words lodged in my chest. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he showed me a photo, Claire, unmistakably her, standing beside a man I'd never seen. They were outside a gallery, arms entwined, her smile radiant in a way that cut me deeper than any admission of guilt ever had. "She's been around," my friend said carefully, "just not with you." The betrayal was familiar, but this time it was sharpened by the realization that she had not just drifted away, she had chosen someone else, someone new. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our unraveling. Had she planned this from the beginning? Was I merely a bridge between one life and the next? Or worse, was I her fallback, the safety net she returned to until something better appeared? The questions poisoned me, and by morning I could no longer sit still. I needed answers. I found myself outside her apartment, the place that had once felt like home. The building loomed above me, familiar yet foreign, and as I climbed the stairs, my pulse thundered in my ears. When the door opened, it was Claire who stood before me. It was him, the man from the photo. He was taller than me, broad-shouldered, his expression guarded. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of Claire, her eyes widening with shock. "David," she breathed, stepping forward. The man looked between us, confusion written across his face. "Who is this?" For a moment none of us spoke. The silence stretched, suffocating. Finally, Claire said, "He's someone I used to love." Used to. The phrase crushed me more than any denial could have. I laughed then, a bitter, hollow sound that startled even me. "Used to," I repeated. "Claire, you never stopped using me." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't reach for me. She didn't beg. She only whispered, "I'm sorry." I left before she could say more. I stumbled down the stairs, out into the street, the cold air slicing at my skin. For the first time, I felt not just betrayed, but replaced, and that was a wound deeper than any infidelity. The weeks that followed were a blur. I tried to bury myself in work, in routine, in anything that might dull the ache. But the truth is, healing doesn't come with distraction, it comes with confrontation. And I had yet to face what Claire had truly done to me. One night, unable to resist, I went back through our old messages. The midnight confessions, the songs she sent, the little thinking of you notes. Each one read differently now, painted with the knowledge that I was never her only one. I was the comfort she craved when her world tilted, the steady hand she held when the others let go. I was never the choice, I was the option. That realization broke something in me that even betrayal hadn't. And yet, here is the strangest part. Even then, even knowing I had been replaced, some part of me still longed for her. Still hoped she might show up at my door one last time, soaked from the rain, whispering apologies I would foolishly accept. Because love, when corrupted, becomes an addiction. You know it's killing you, but you can't stop reaching for the poison. I wish I could tell you that was the end, that I finally walked away and rebuilt myself, stronger and wiser. But the truth is never so clean. Claire wasn't finished with me, and I wasn't finished with her. Because months later, when the scars had just begun to form, I received a message that would pull me back into her orbit with a force I couldn't resist. It was only 2 words. "I need you." When her message appeared on my phone, 2 words, simple but devastating, I froze. "I need you." It was a plea, but also a command, and the weight of it dragged me back into her gravity before I could resist. Months of silence had dulled the ache, but those words tore the scab open in an instant. I told myself I wouldn't answer. I told myself I was stronger now, wiser, no longer that desperate man who waited by the door for her shadow to appear. But lies, especially the ones we tell ourselves, are fragile things. Before the night was over, I had replied, "Where are you?" Her address came a moment later, one I didn't recognize. She had moved, of course. New beginnings, new man, new life. Yet she still reached for me, and I, the fool, still came running. I found her sitting on the floor of a sparsely furnished apartment, her knees pulled to her chest, her face streaked with tears. She looked small, diminished, a far cry from the woman who once walked into rooms and turned heads with effortless magnetism. When she saw me, she didn't smile. She only whispered, I didn't know who else to call. I wanted to ask about him, the man who had replaced me, the one who now haunted my memory like a phantom rival. But her eyes, red and swollen, silenced me. Instead, I sat beside her, waiting. Finally, she spoke. He left, just walked out. No explanation, no goodbye, and I realized, her voice cracked. I realized I've been chasing something I never truly had, running from myself, from the only person who ever stayed. Her words should have filled me with vindication, but instead, they hollowed me out. Because they weren't really about me. They were about her emptiness, her loneliness, and I was simply the vessel she poured it into. Still, I stayed that night. I held her as she cried, the familiar scent of her hair washing over me, the fragile warmth of her body pressed against mine. It was a cruel comfort, like returning to a fire that had already burned me, knowing the flames would consume me again. In the days that followed, we fell into a strange rhythm. She called, I answered. She reached, I caught her. She faltered, I steadied her. But beneath it all, I knew this wasn't love. Not anymore. It was survival for her and maybe for me too. The breaking point came one evening when she asked, "Do you still love me?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth, but no words came. I searched myself for the truth, and for the first time I found nothing. No fire, no ache, no desperate longing, only exhaustion. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I was no longer standing in her shadow. Somewhere in the silence of those months apart, I had begun to heal, even if I hadn't recognized it. So I told her the truth. I don't know. Her face crumpled as if I had struck her. She whispered, I don't want to lose you. And that was when it hit me. She had never feared losing me. She had only feared being alone. That night as she slept on my couch, the same couch where her betrayal had first unraveled before me, I made my decision. In the morning I wrote her a note. Nothing poetic, nothing dramatic. Just a few plain words. I can't save you, and I can't lose myself trying. Then I left. It wasn't easy. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to check on her, to play the savior one more time. But I kept walking, each step heavier and lighter at once. In the weeks that followed, she called, she messaged. She even came by my place, pounding on the door until my neighbors complained. But I didn't answer, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. For the first time in years, I chose myself. And slowly, life returned. I rediscovered laughter, though it felt foreign at first. I reconnected with friends I had pushed away. I even found moments of peace in silence, where once silence had been unbearable. Do I still think of her? Of course. You don't simply erase someone like Claire. She lingers like smoke in old clothes, faint but unmistakable. Sometimes I catch myself wondering where she is, if she's still running, still searching for someone to fill the void she refuses to face. But here's the truth I carry now. Love, when poisoned by betrayal, doesn't vanish overnight. It fades, it scars, it teaches. And if you're lucky, it leaves behind not bitterness but clarity. Claire was the great wound of my life, but she was also the lesson. The lesson that love without trust is only longing, that forgiveness without change is only surrender, and that some people are not meant to be saved, especially when saving them means losing yourself. So when I look back now, I don't see her as the love of my life. I see her as the fire that nearly consumed me, and the ashes from which I had to rise. And in that rising, I found something she could never give me, myself.